And you will have to do the recording, because I had some trouble with the earlier Zoom, but I don't have enough room on the disk to record these sessions.
It's happening. We're already recording.
Right. Okay, so back to Edmund. Interestingly, Edgar does not seem taken in by this part of the ruse. Perhaps labeling Gloucester credulous and Edgar noble are rather precise here by Edmund. Gloucester is more gullible than Edgar, especially in matters of superstition. Edgar is noble, unable to conceive of harming others, and therefore he doesn't do a good job defending himself against such harmful schemes. But he's not prone to believe in things as silly as astrology. Neither Edmund nor Edgar provide any real refutation of astrology, however. Augustine, with his own issues with an adulterous father, explicitly repudiates astrology. This is in Book 4. I made no move whatever to break off my habit of consulting those charlatans whom people call mathematicians. For I took the view that no sacrifice was being offered by them, nor any prayers addressed to spirits in the practice of divination. Nonetheless, true Christian piety is consistent with its own principles in rejecting and condemning astrology. It is good to confess to you, when people say the sky is responsible for your sin, so you cannot avoid it, or Venus did it, or Saturn, or Mars, they invalidate our whole salvation. They are suggesting that human beings are guiltless, humans who are flesh and blood and putrid pride, and that the fault lies with the creator and controller of sky and stars. And who is this? You are God's sweetness and the fount of justice, who will repay each of us our actions as our actions deserve, and do not disdain a broken and humbled heart. It is interesting that Augustine's main reason for patronizing those who cast horoscopes is some fastidiousness about what is permissible for a Christian. Merely looking for predictions from some source other than God seems to him at this time not necessarily forbidden, as long as it involves neither worship nor necromancy. One can see his point. If one were categorically forbidden from consulting with experts who examine created beings in order to make predictions about the future, then weather forecasting would be equally unlawful. But then Augustine hits on exactly the same criticism we saw from Edmund in order to condemn astrology. It is a silly way to avoid responsibility. Augustine takes it much further than Edmund, who has nowhere shown any concern about invalidating our salvation. Augustine even connects it with blasphemy explicitly. If one avoids guilt oneself and puts it on the stars, then one has put the blame ultimately on the creators of the stars. It's curious then that Augustine sticks with astrology as long as he does. Perhaps if he confined his queries just to outside matters and didn't look to the stars to excuse his own bad behavior, Augustine could justify the practice. But then that raises the problem we did not see addressed anywhere in King Lear. This is to consider whether or not astrology works on some factual level, whether or not its predictions are accurate. Augustine repeatedly expresses much more interest in this question than does any character in King Lear. It is astrology's accuracy to which Augustine returns several times. If pressed, I think Augustine could have an unassailable response. It can't hurt, at least until really disconfirming evidence is found. And Augustine also has an interesting and influential experience of astronomy, in addition to astrology. If astrologers made highly dubious claims about what eclipses or conjunctions or comets meant, they could at least base their claims on extremely accurate data about those phenomena, unlike the Manichees. From Book 5. For all that, I kept in mind many true conclusions which they had drawn from creation itself. And I saw that these could be verified by calculation, by observing the succession of the seasons and the visible evidence of the stars. I then compared them with the assertions of Mani, who had written voluminously and incoherently on these subjects. What I read there was confirmed neither by any rational account of solstices and equinoxes and eclipses, nor by anything else of this kind. that I learned from books of secular philosophy. Augustine's abandoning the Manichees was to some extent data-driven. Many others had accurate data about the movements of celestial bodies, while the Manichees said things that were verifiably untrue at the physical, factual level. Augustine always seems more interested in their theoretical problems about the origin of evil, but he cannot completely ignore the less fraught, but much more certain questions about physical reality, and on which astrologers are on firmer, more trustworthy ground than the Manichees. It is only upon hearing of a very elaborate experiment related to him by a friend that Augustine considers astrology finally untrue enough that he can give up on it completely. His friend Firminus tells of how he was born, tells about how when he was born, an enslaved woman nearby was also giving birth. Both Firminus's father and the slave owner were very interested in astrology, so he had arranged to inform one another when people gave birth in their households, so their horoscopes could be calculated with great accuracy. Firminus relates the events of the night of his own birth. It happened like this. As the women went into labor, the two friends sent word to each other to let each other know what was happening at the other's house, and held messengers in readiness who would announce to each the birth of the child as soon as it occurred. It was easy for them to arrange for instantaneous announcement since each was master in his own domain. So Firminus related, the two sets of messengers were dispatched and met at a point exactly halfway between the two houses, which meant that neither of the friends could assign a different position of the stars or record any different moment of time. Yet Firminus was born in easy circumstances among his own relatives and pursued quite a brilliant career in the world, making money and advancing in rank, while that slave boy went on serving his masters with no alleviation whatever of the yoke his status imposed on him. Firminus, who knew him, testified to this fact. And as soon as I heard this story, which in view of the narrator's character I believed, my obstinate resistance was completely overcome and dropped away. Augustine goes on to consider the case of twins, who obviously have the same horoscope, but don't live identical lives. Augustine mentions the specific biblical pair of Jacob and Esau, who were very different in disposition and in the events of their lives. However, suggested any of these individually, the overall observation that many people must have the same exact horoscope and are almost certainly not all experiencing the same things seems convincing enough to Augustine for him to abandon this idea of using nature to predict events in human lives. All right, I guess I'm right at 15 minutes for that, which I think is what we're shooting for. Thank you.
Thank you. Straight over to me. Is that the way it goes?
Again, I don't have the order of papers in front of me.
Yeah, I think it's me. I think so.
Okay.
I think that was second. And all the questions are at the end, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I think yes, would be short. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Wolfenden. I'm from East London Science School in the UK. My paper is about Venus and Adonis by William Shakespeare, published in April 1593, 428 years ago. But before we travel back in time, please allow me a brief digression to the year before COVID-19. How the Classics Made Shakespeare by Shakespeare scholar Jonathan Bate, published in 2019, is the book that reopened the classics for me. I'm a secondary school, high school, that is, English teacher of 11 to 18-year-old students. This book explores a world that I knew existed, but even now feel I'm only just venturing into. In fact, Bates' book was a major reason for taking up my colleague Mark Taylor's suggestion to attend the thoroughly stimulating ACTC Reinventing and Rejuvenating the Liberal Arts at Carthage College in the same year, 2019. I don't teach classical literature. By this, I mean I'm referring to Greek or Roman literature, broadly between 8th century BC and 6th century AD. I teach an introduction to Beowulf and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But apart from those works, Shakespeare is the furthest I go back in terms of set texts. I'm not an academic, but I believe secondary school teachers should continually aspire to be more knowledgeable about their subject. In English literature, apart from reading broadly and deeply, that means understanding the profound and complex relationships between the beginnings of literature to those of the present day. When you first stumble across a new allusion in a Shakespeare play, you freeze in your tracks because you know that Shakespeare is alluding to something important, but you might not know what that is. Take this one from Hamlet's first soliloquy, where he compares his late father to his uncle. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion to a satyr. It's from the "Oh, that this too solid flesh" soliloquy. You can obviously refer to the notes in the glossary, and you discover that Hyperion was the Greek god of the sun, and that a satyr was a grotesque creature, half human, half goat. Okay, but if that is all you know as much as your students do, and they've read the same glossary, and that is not where we should be as educators. We should always want to go deeper, to know more. And to be a good teacher of Shakespeare, at the very least, you need to have Shakespeare's literary backstory. You need to know something about the literary world he was educated in and was fascinated by. This has to intrigue you, otherwise it's very difficult to teach Shakespeare. At East London Science School, we encourage teachers to immerse themselves in their subjects. Apologies if this is obvious to anyone in this workshop, but for me, late in life, next big birthday, 60, this desire to know more about core texts, in this case classical texts, has become essential to my educational worldview. Here is Jonathan Bate on this matter from How the Classics Made Shakespeare. Shakespeare absorbed classical thought, but was not enslaved to it. Shakespeare was a thinker who always made it new, adapted his source materials, and put his own spin on them. Before he read Plutarch, he read Ovid, the author in whose work he found the things that made him a poet and a dramatist: magic, myth, metamorphosis, rendered with playfulness, verbal dexterity, and generic promiscuity. During the beginning of the school closures in the UK lockdown, I started reading the classical tragedies with my daughter, who's about to go to university to study theatre. I've buried more deeply into the two set texts that I teach at school, Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, in terms of Shakespeare, and this has led me to Venus and Adonis. End of digression. Here is the essence of my paper. Shakespeare was 28 years old when his early acting and playwriting career met an unexpected obstacle, the outbreak of bubonic plague in London in the summer of 1592. The theatres were closed as a precautionary measure to stop people congregating in large numbers, rings a bell, in small spaces, and they were not reopened until June 1594, so nearly a whole 2 years. Depending on which play chronology you follow, he'd probably only got 5 plays under his belt when he was forced to turn to poetry. Evidently, this was a setback, but the young Shakespeare would have seen himself primarily as a poet. All the plays written so far were written in blank verse, as was the vogue established by other Elizabethan playwrights such as Christopher Marlowe. The result of this shift in creative and commercial direction led to the publishing of Venus and Adonis in April 1593. This narrative poem became Shakespeare's most successful selling publication, being reprinted 9 times during his lifetime. And his decision to return to the classical Roman poet Ovid, which he'd studied as a Stratford-upon-Avon grammar school boy, had a transformative effect on his subsequent playwriting. This brilliant, sophisticated, erotic comedy, Stanley Wells, led with tragic and pastoral elements, fizzed with the themes and ideas that would light up Love's Labour's Lost, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, and arguably the remaining 30 plus plays he would write in his lifetime. Venus and Adonis gave Shakespeare the freedom to experiment with form, the mixing of comedy and tragedy, and to add his own take on the war between love and lust. The title page of Venus and Adonis suggests that Shakespeare's embellishment of a short section from the end of Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses was in part a retort to his detractors, the university wits. The two-line epigraph taken from Ovid reads, and excuse my Latin, Villa miritur vulgus mihi flavus Apollo pocula Castalia plena ministret aqua, which translates as, let the common man admire trash or vile things, may golden Apollo serve me full cups of Castalian waters. Shakespeare was letting Robert Greene, who had accused him of being an upstart crow, and the other wits know that he may not have a university degree, but he knew his Latin, whilst also saying, I am capable of drinking from the Castalian spring of classical inspiration and have aspirations to be considered the English equivalent of that most urbane of classical poets, Jonathan Bates. Shakespeare was, in modern parlance, weaponizing his writing of poetry, and what is more, his first dedication on the same title page to the Right Honourable Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, made an explicit plea for noble patronage, which was continued in his follow-up narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, and the sonnets, which is believed he also began composing during his theatrical interregnum. In writing Venus Adonis, Shakespeare was putting down a marker as an individual poet, a singular voice. Many of the early plays were likely to have been, to different degrees, collaborative ventures. Venus and Adonis was Shakespeare on his own, the auteur poet. Venus and Adonis is a wonderfully intense read. There are three voices, the narrator, Venus, the god of love, and the handsome youth, Adonis, who speaks as little as possible. It is a tale of female unrequited love with a tragic end. The relentless rhetoric, pleading and use of physical force, who plucks him from his horse, that Venus deploys to persuade Adonis to make love to her, is both hilarious in its persistence and stiflingly erotic. Sick-thoughted Venus makes amain unto him, and like a bold-faced suitor gins to woo him. Shakespeare establishes early in the poem that Venus is sick-thoughted, that her attraction to Adonis is like an illness. She's also a bold-faced suitor, implying that her blatant wooing had qualities which were more commonly associated with men. This role reversal, or at the very least uncompromising forthrightness, is certainly mirrored in the characters of Juliet and Titania in their respective plays, Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, that Shakespeare was to write in 1594 to 95, after the plague had gone and when the theatres had reopened. Ovid's fascination with transgression and transformation was shared by Shakespeare. Venus becomes the template for, in fact, many later female characters who pursue the opposite sex, disguised as a man or not. The animal imagery and interchangeability of the human with the animal world is also a great source of the poem's humour and intoxicating eroticism. After the goddess pulls Adonis to the ground and launches her campaign for kisses, Shakespeare's simile captures the boy's awkwardness as a diving waterfowl who, like a dive dapper, peering through a wave, who being looked on ducks as quickly in. Venus cannot believe she's being rejected, and so with a masculine-like pride boasts of her conquests with Mars, the direful god of war, and the language takes a turn towards unsubtle innuendo. Over my altars hath he hung his lance, she brags. The phallic imagery may titillate the reader, but falls on the deaf ears of Adonis. So Venus switches to her next line of attack. Love is light in weight like fire, so why is it heavy unto thee, she says. Adonis finally cries in desperation, "Fie no more of love, the sun doth burn my face, I must remove." Nevertheless, Venus's obsessive pestering further intensifies after receiving no response from her quarry, so she offers herself to Adonis completely. "I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or in dale. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower where the pleasant fountains lie." The sexual enticements continue in the following stanza with offerings of sweet bottom grass, presumably pubic hair, and round rising hillocks, breasts. The reader must know by now that she's not going to get away, but we still have 956 lines to go, 80% of the poem. We need not worry. Shakespeare's narrative poem is an exploration of the dramatic without a stage. One can imagine him crafting each line to create the suffocating mood of the scene, coupled with taking some relish in its bawdy theme. He knew his audience well, as proven by the multiple reprints of this poem. The story drives onward into a second section where Adonis's attempt to leave Venus with his horse and go hunting, but this is interrupted by the arrival of a female horse, a breeding jennet, lusty, young and proud. The speaker's voice anticipates Venus's lesson and describes how Adonis's aroused steed breaks free from his reins and pursues his mate. The male horse is the model male, idealized like a perfectly painted horse in shape, in courage, color, pace, and bone. This superb sequence elevates and anthropomorphizes the natural ritual of horses mating into a lesson for Adonis. Do as animals do, Venus seems to be saying. The scenes between Bottom and Titania from A Midsummer Night's Dream are foreshadowed here. It is a reverse image, a contrast to Venus's unsuccessful attempts to get her boy to behave like a real man. Shakespeare has set up the next phase of Venus's tortuous emotional rhetoric. We know she's going to use the steed's passion for the mare as a comparison that Adonis must learn from. Her sexual crusade continues. Shakespeare's 6-line stanzas of iambic pentameter with a rhyming scheme of A, B, C, C is followed by Shakespeare with an almost rigid formality. In fact, this particular rhyme scheme and length became known as the Venus and Adonis stanza. The final rhyming couplets of each stanza move the story forward, often underlining the actions of Venus or her demands. The reader's ears quickly learn to anticipate what the couplet might reveal by the final word of line 5. Look in mine eyeballs, there thy beauty lies. Then why not lips on lips, since eyes in eyes? This is typical of the regularity of the meter throughout the poem, but also captures the essence of Venus's logic and her rhetorical genius. Look into my eyes and you will see the beauty that is you and me, of course. Now let our lips meet too, she insists. We're reminded of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet when Romeo ignores Juliet's gentle rejection at the Capulets' party by playfully suggesting that she let lips do what hands do, they pray. This time, however, Shakespeare's wooer is a woman, Venus, the goddess, no less. In spite of Shakespeare's implicit protest defending his Latin knowledge, he's likely to have turned to the first direct translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses into English by Arthur Golding, which was completed in 1567 and revised in 1575 and was very popular at the time. Ovid was widely believed to be Shakespeare's favourite author, being name-checked in Love Labour's Lost and read by characters in Titus Andronicus and Cymbeline. However, the importance of this poem is far more profound than a classical name drop in future plays. Shakespeare was testing his adaptive, embellishing storytelling skills to meet the narrative hunger of the Elizabethan age, the end of the English Renaissance. The plague and the resulting closure of the theatres gave Shakespeare the opportunity to explore his Ovidian inspirations that were seeded in him as a grammar school boy. We are indebted to Shakespeare, to Ovid, to Hesiod, and to whomever came before. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I guess we're transition. So quick introduction. My name is Nick McAfee. I'm a third-year politics PhD student at the University of Dallas. And the title of my paper is Nietzsche's Dionysian Hamlet, Prospects and Pitfalls. And just a small word, I've been at a HCTC conference a couple years ago, and so I do remember the kind of more abbreviated paper length. Unfortunately, when I spoke to one of the conference people not too long ago, I was under the impression that we had something like 20 to 25 minutes. So I'm going to do my best to kind of jettison the less important obnoxious method comments, and you guys can feel free to trust me or not, and dig into me afterwards as you see fit. Even in his first completed book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Friedrich Nietzsche's unique insights into art and artistry are gripping. His tone is delightfully polemical, his approach intuitive yet subversive. Especially provocative is the almost authoritative manner with which he appropriates classical tragedians and tragedies for his own narrative purposes, confidently using them to depict the interplay between the Dionysian and Apollonian elements within the Greek genius and its successors. One notable successor is identified as Shakespeare, and Nietzsche asserts that the character of Hamlet looks something like the Dionysian man in his lethargic, post-rapturous state. Curiously, Nietzsche's investment in this resemblance prompts him to briefly wade into debates about the doctrine of Hamlet, rejecting along the way one possible interpretation of what wisdom is contained therein. Some 10 sections of the work later, he recaps the previously unmentioned lesson of Hamlet by clarifying his deductive approach, his deductive method, for understanding the titular character. Nietzsche's approach is not focused on Hamlet's speech, but rather a profound contemplation and survey of the whole. Although this treatment of Hamlet is admittedly brief within The Birth of Tragedy, Shakespeare resurfaces throughout Nietzsche's corpus as one of the paradigmatic great artists whose work, particularly Hamlet, is deemed worthy of critical engagement. It is not surprising then that Nietzsche's readers have sometimes felt an invitation to take up their own reading of Hamlet with The Birth of Tragedy as its starting point. In this paper, I will endeavor to undertake such an assessment of my own, posing the following 3 questions for consideration. What does Nietzsche's reading of Hamlet and its titular character essentially consist of? What, if anything, does his reading illuminate in Hamlet? And what might it obfuscate? The road to answering such questions poses an immediate difficulty. My general approach to interpreting the bard diverges significantly from that of Nietzsche. What follows in this paper much more closely approximates the search for practical wisdom articulated by the late John Alvis in his seminal work, Shakespeare's Understanding of Honor. So is the pursuit of Shakespeare's moral insights, though utterly inimical to a Nietzschean reading of Hamlet? Some Nietzscheans seem to think so. Still, the thought of the great immoralist himself seems to elsewhere invite future reappropriations of this kind. I'd say his perspectivism is far from absolutely relativistic, in the sense that all truth claims are equally valid or plausible. So even if one grants his profound skepticism towards Norna's suggestions, he might allow for an investigation on the grounds of what Alexander Namus calls the search for small, specific truths and belief in them. And moreover, if the paradoxes within Nietzsche's thought, especially as regards the thorny question of their prescriptive value, might ultimately be resolved by reference to a project of him elaborating his ideal character of himself, and I'm following Namus in that respect, I don't think he should mind if I borrow his perspective, his eyes, so to speak, for my own project. So how does Hamlet resemble a Dionysian man? In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche takes up Hamlet only after setting up the conflict between Apollonian dreaming and Dionysian reverie, archetypes through which he purports to explain the cultural function of Greek tragedy. A glimpse of what the Dionysian entails, Nietzsche tells us, can be derived from two types of psychological phenomena considered together. First, the terror one feels when the principle of sufficient reason fails. And second, the blissful ecstasy of forgetfulness that accompanies a temporary loss of one's individuating principle. Returning to ordinary sense experience and memory after this rapture subsides is jarring to the Dionysian celebrant, who is subsequently left in an exhausted, nauseated state. Nietzsche thus proceeds, and I'll just quote it in its entirety here so we can have it on the table. In this sense, the Dionysian man resembles Hamlet. Both have once looked truly into the essence of things. They have gained knowledge, and nausea inhibits action. For their action could not change anything in the eternal nature of things. They feel it to be ridiculous or humiliating that they should be asked to set right a world that is out of joint. Knowledge kills action. Action requires the veil of illusion. That is the doctrine of Hamlet, not that cheap wisdom of Jack the Dreamer, who reflects too much and, as it were, from an excess of possibilities, does not get around to action. Not reflection, no. True knowledge and insight into the horrible truth outweighs any motive for action, both in Hamlet and the Dionysian man. Now no comfort avails anymore. Longing transcends a world after death, even the gods. Existence is negated along with its glittering reflection in the gods or in an immortal beyond. Conscious of the truth he has once seen, man now sees everywhere only the horror or absurdity of existence. Now he understands what is symbolic in Ophelia's fate. Now he understands the wisdom of the sylvan god Silenus. He is nauseated. End quote. In relation to Hamlet, the most essential feature of the Dionysian character is that slogan, knowledge kills action, specifically knowledge of the world's absurdity and the fruitlessness of striving for an afterlife. It is important that one not immediately conclude that Nietzsche identifies Dionysianism with inaction, per se. The enervated actions above seem to primarily consist of attempts to alter or push against the eternal nature of things, attempts to set right a world that is out of joint. Nor is this account of nausea the last word on the various states in which a Dionysian man is said to inhabit. Nussbaum appears to correctly indicate contra Schopenhauer, through the witness of, quote, Dionysius and the energies he represents, the spectator is seduced back into life, brought to a firm life, and his own cognitive order-making activity, end quote. This allows us to infer that Nietzsche grasps the problem of distinguishing among the various Hamlets, so to speak, which occupy the stage of the course of the play's action. The Hamlet who wishes his too sullied flesh would melt in Act 1 seems a little different, at least, from the Hamlet of Act 5, who invokes divine providence in facing the possibility of death. Nietzsche's insistence, moreover, in vindicating Hamlet of his self-description as a John of Dreams gives a specific instance of his stated exegetical preference for action over speech. Both of these observations implicitly suggest that readers following in Nietzsche's rake should be watchful to see whether or not Hamlet finally ends up being seduced out of nausea or back into a life of action. Nausea is a complex motif in Nietzsche's corpus. It is only a sign of potential health, I would suggest, for one who can stomach Dionysian truth. A more complete actualization of health involves some degree of self-making, self-mastery for those strong free spirits. It's a positive project of willfulness that consists of, but is certainly not limited to, the metaphysical comfort he describes in Birth of Tragedy. To be sure, the unity or coherence of such a willful person is not to be found in the coherence of their desires or drives, if considered from some abstract point of reference. In Amos' reading, Nietzsche repeatedly denies that such a coherence exists, but the apparent inconsistencies of a free-spirited or sovereign individual must be intentional and chosen, not the result of weakness or lack of self-restraint. In this way, the Dionysian man's nausea somehow exists on the way, we might say, to the highest human being, an individual who, quote, would have the highest multiplicity of drives in the relatively greatest strength that can be endured. Indeed, where the plant human being shows itself strongest, one finds instincts that conflict powerfully, for example, in Shakespeare, but are controlled, end quote. And that's from The Will to Power. The Nietzschean ideal human, which I think is probably himself, can therefore be viewed in a rough continuity across his works. Hamlet's designation as Dionysian, or like one, then, invites examining his character against the elaboration of this ideal as expressed in different ways. So to briefly summarize what I've been saying so far, The Dionysian man is characterized by embrace of horrible truth, the temporary renunciation of memory and selfhood, which takes place in artistic and occultic reverie. The Dionysian man's appetite for certain kinds of action is sapped by his resulting philosophic hangover. But this nausea is a necessary waypoint on a journey out of nihilism and towards the ideal of active self-mastery and self-creation. Okay, so what are the prospects of a Nietzschean Hamlet? As we have seen, the center of Nietzsche's exegesis consists of the inverse relationship between knowledge and motivation. Hamlet's apparent inertia, both in his dalliance with suicide and with respect to the ghost's commission to bring justice on Claudius, is for Nietzsche best explained as a result of his terrible insight, and not because of some indecisiveness in the face of too many considerations. In at least one sense, this reading of Hamlet is incredibly compelling. His dispirited obsession with the mutability of the universe dominates his field of vision, constraining and curbing what appetite he has to right the wrongs of Denmark. This nausea, I would suggest, derives from the same two elements towards which his outrage is directed: fortune's caprice and human weakness. Hamlet chooses to have the players perform a speech on the death of Priam, a speech which insults fortune, the strumpet, and calls for her overthrow. His choice makes sense, for the piece itself epitomizes and confirms his belief that the world is held hostage by degrading, undiscriminating chance. Hamlet also maintains a thoroughgoing hostility towards the body and its passions. His initial invective against his mother's quick switch from widowhood to marriage is illustrative. Not only does Hamlet misogynistically extend the scope of criticism to the entire female sex, but he also frames his mother's regression in appetites by an unfavorable comparison with animals. Critics have rightly observed that this emphasis on corruption, degradation, and the overthrow of reason accompany his tirades against the body throughout the play. Nietzsche's Dionysian comparison is also helpful insofar as it draws our attention to the way Hamlet's encounter with suffering leads him to a kind of separation and withdrawal from others. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche counts the cynicism of Hamlet as among those, quote, free, insolent spirits who would like to conceal and deny that they are broken, proud, incurable hearts, end quote. This concealment, sometimes taking on the appearance of buffoonery or foolishness, serves the pride of one who has entered into the depths of Dionysian suffering from knowledge, and who cannot bear interaction with those who do not or cannot share in such knowledge. The implication is not terribly obscure. The weight of being misunderstood in cases like these is to have one's pain, and therefore oneself, trivialized or dismissed. Nietzsche's summary of the resulting dynamic is pithy. Quote, profound suffering makes noble, it separates, end quote. Although Hamlet's antic disposition is assumed to disguise his pursuit of vengeance, Nietzsche's insight connects his adoption of the mask of insanity with his efforts elsewhere to distance himself from those who he wants to misunderstand him. His verbal laceration of Ophelia in 3:1, perhaps the greatest example of this distancing, should not be merely construed as a necessary component of his quest for vengeance. I think Nietzsche would almost certainly agree with Alvis that Hamlet's wrath breaks forth against his former love, precisely because she is, in his mind, bound up with the aforementioned uselessness, sinfulness, and absurdity of the human race. Nietzsche's final contribution to the reception of Hamlet involves counterintuitively the way in which his the reading of sovereign, free-spirited individuals serves to highlight Hamlet's failures in this respect. Undoubtedly, Hamlet at times appears on his way to approximating a Nietzschean ideal. He shares the immoralist's obsession with human willfulness, and his greatest imitative desires are aimed at characters of strength and assertiveness, for instance, his emulation of Fortinbras. It is on this basis that Timothy Piles can, I think mistakenly, characterize the killing of Polonius, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and Claudius as a release from, quote, his lethargy and despondency into decisive action, end quote. As was discussed earlier, however, the ideal of Nietzschean willfulness consists in self-mastery and deliberate activity, a self-created harmony of drive subordinated by a master drive. And measured by that account of action, Hamlet is shown to be wanted. The most obvious manifestation of Hamlet's lack of self-control appears in his painful inability to refrain from caustic combativeness when doing so would help him accomplish his self-professed plan of vengeance. In contrast with the skillful play acting of, say, Junius Brutus in pretending to be insane in Shakespeare's Rape of Lucrece, The plot of Hamlet draws our attention to the consequences of Hamlet's repeated failure to convince. Far from being decisive, the prince's bluster about having a firm bosom melts away at the second approach of the ghost, whose piteous action does indeed seem to convert Hamlet's stern effects. And rather than having attained a new peaceful acceptance of life via play acting and murder, as some critics have argued, Hamlet, upon his return to Denmark in Act 5, immediately breaks his collected demeanor to engage in a verbal and physical brawl with Laertes over and in Ophelia's grave. There is a meaningful change in Hamlet's character before and after the voyage abroad, but on the eve of the fateful duel, he still has no coherent plan for finally making good on his fateful task. He ultimately kills Claudius, yes. But like so many other circumstances in the play, Denmark's prince cannot be praised for anything more than reacting to contingent circumstances he neither foresaw nor took pains to arrange. Nietzsche does not, to my knowledge, explicitly point to Hamlet's inadequacies in this way. Nevertheless, his account of the sovereign individual's will and willfulness invites similar scrutiny of all such Dionysian men. So really quickly, the pitfalls of Nietzsche's reading of Hamlet. Although Hamlet's outrage at fortune and fallen humanity is largely consonant with Dionysian nausea, Nietzsche's personal sympathy for the initial will-negating effect of terrible truth averts his gaze and that of his readers from one of the central suggestions that Hamlet seems designed to make. Hamlet's inertia consists of a number of contingent choices, and the costs of his choices are dramatically displayed for disturbing effect. This effect only works on the audience precisely because an alternative option, a hope of setting right the disjointed time, was meaningfully on the table, so to speak. Perhaps the best example of how Shakespeare uses tragic poignancy is found in the sequence surrounding the grave of Ophelia. Ophelia's love, lucidity, and life are all, directly or indirectly, compromised by Hamlet's aforementioned excess of sentimentality and failure to master himself. Now, Hamlet is far from alone in terms of responsibility for her demise. We can talk about Polonius's role in that. All the same, one must take notice of Shakespeare's central plot device, the ghost's commission of vengeance, which points against the logic of Dionysian inactivity and its minimizing of personal accountability. And it points towards the pursuit of a common good, which transcends personal self-creation, that is, justice. This commission is given to Hamlet, and the dramatic resolution of the play largely hinges on the question of whether Hamlet will fulfill his obligations or fail to do so. Our vision of what the Hamlet comedy might have looked like is not consigned by the bard to mere speculation. Instead, our senses of sight and sound are turned to Gertrude as she scatters flowers on Ophelia's remains. Sweets to the sweet, farewell. I hope thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not have strewed thy grave. The flowers serve as a bridge between the two images, the two possible realities, marriage and burial. That the two share such conceptual and visual proximity drives home the poignancy of the moment. I think a closer look at poignancy is needed because it reveals how Nietzsche's insistence on the underlying meaninglessness of reality risks obfuscating those basic dramatic tensions which grip attentive audiences and serve as the lifeblood of Shakespearean stage plays. This lost opportunity of a wedding is painful, precisely to the degree that it was a real opportunity, that it was really lost. Gertrude does not lament over cosmic absurdity. She laments because something beautiful, something better than madness and death, was actually within reach, if only a contingent chain of choice and circumstance had not led to its slipping away. It does not seem likely that by having his audience witness Ophelia's suffering, Shakespeare intends to absolve Hamlet from his responsibility to have done better by her and others. To leverage the Dionysian reading of Hamlet in such a manner would risk senselessly drowning out the dramatic power of carefully crafted moments like this one. And I could go on to mention that I think the missed opportunity thread that Shakespeare pushes is not limited to romance. I think there's also indications that Shakespeare wants us to take seriously political prudence. You see that hinted at in Rosencrantz's Excursus in the Fall of Kings in 3:3. Taken as a whole, Nietzsche's reading meaningfully advances an appreciation of Hamlet's motivations and deficiencies, but his approach proves inadequate to the extent that it frames Hamlet's Dionysian stupor as in some kind of reasonable or blameless light. Spoken or no, the events of Hamlet invite audiences to measure its titular character and carefully consider his failings. With Nietzsche, we can affirm that Hamlet saw the human race's condition as essentially absurd and often conducted himself as such. With Shakespeare, we can affirm, on the basis of dramatic evidence, that such conduct came with profound, even blameworthy costs. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
both. Yes. Both of those were very interesting. Thank you. As always at ACTC, we have plenty of time for discussion, conversation. Also typical. Well, I was going to say also typical of ACTC meetings. It's an intimate group, so please. I can't imagine myself leading a discussion. So how do we wish to converse?
I'll be happy to throw in a question if no one else is burning with one.
We're not.
Thank you guys so much for your papers. Richard, I'm curious, not being very familiar with Venus and Adonis, my sense is, Shakespeare's view of Venus, maybe as infused with Ovid or more or less, at least by the end, there's some reason that he's thrown some jabs in her direction. I'm thinking especially of the Tempest, the way that, Prospero, who I think is largely shown in a kind of reasonable light, has to, very obviously expel Venus and her son from the pageantry of marriage that he's conducting for his daughter. And I think one could maybe mention even the reference to Ovid and Cymbeline as the fact that Imogen is reading this really late into the night is part of the sentimentality that maybe leaves her open to a villain like Iachimo. And so I'm just wondering, do you think that the characterization of, is the Venus of Venus and Adonis, assuming that I'm right about this, the Venus that Shakespeare is maybe interested in kind of expelling from some of his late plays, or at least corralling in some way?
Very interesting question. Possibly. I think what I found in looking at the original, or at least the original translation of the Ovid and what Shakespeare did with the story, it's only 88 lines at the end of book 10 that Shakespeare expands into 1,194. And I was just trying to think about what he was doing with that, because he actually cuts out the Atalanta and Hippomenes digression, which is Venus's long-winded way of trying to say, beware wild animals. It's a long story. Beware wild animals. Don't go and hunt the boar, because I'm going to prophesy that you're going to die. And so Shakespeare takes that out of the story, very much with an eye to how to connect to his audience, I think, and goes on and puts Venus in a situation where she has to really try and argue about why she's right that Adonis should love her, and why she's right that he's going to be killed by the boar. And that's it takes out the digression, but her argument can't win. She's already exhausted herself in her pleading and her pressurizing, her physical plucking him off his horse. So I think in a way Shakespeare is exploring the kind of the exasperating lust of Venus is just not enough. And so he is putting this character up to for criticism. And what I love about the Venus and Adonis is that after 17 stanzas of where Shakespeare is filling in for the missing digression of Atalanta and Hippomenes, Adonis finally speaks for more than one stanza. and gives his retort to Venus. And I think this kind of echoes many of the love arguments of love that we see in later plays. And he says, "Nay then," quoth Adon, "you will fall again into your idle overhandled theme. The kiss I gave you is bestowed in vain, and all in vain you strive against the stream. For by this black-faced night, desire's foul nurse, your treatise makes me like you worse and worse." And I think the other influence here is clearly Cicero and Shakespeare's interest in rhetoric, because I think he's created two very rhetorical characters. Venus mostly gets most of the lines, but Adonis has to kind of find a way of responding and find a way of building an argument. And so this is the main idea I was trying to explore, is that he may not have been able to write for the stage at that point in time because the theatres were closed, but he went back to his sources, if you like, from grammar school to try and look at what he finds fascinating about stories of love and lust and transformation and transgression, but also he gives them voices. He gives them voices in a far more with far more rhetorical power than is there in Ovid. So it's a long-winded way of not really answering your question. I think you might be right. I'd have to go and explore those. Cymbeline in particular, I don't know particularly well, but those other plays to answer you properly. But I think yes, you might have an argument there.
I love what you said about there's something about a creation of the dramatic of something like a stage experience, even though it's not a play. I think that's definitely true in my reading of Lucrece as well. You can totally imagine, some really awesome, and I'd love to hear it recited out loud someday. I think would be a great gift for those poems.
Thank you.
I have a question for Nicholas, if you guys are ready for a new question. Okay.
Hi.
So with Nietzsche, I always felt like with Nietzsche that he kind of identified more with the Dionysian and I always felt maybe that was because of his upbringing, with his father being a scholar and like the Christian upbringing that he always kind of felt forced into, mostly the institutional and all the roles and stuff like that. I felt like if you read him deeply, he always kind of comes out as this Dionysian that's trying to be an Apollonian too. And so this fusion of both of these personalities was his desire throughout all of his work. He really felt, especially in The Birth of Tragedy, like they needed to be fused in order to be happy. I think it's what he was. So my question though, is that why do you think that he chose Hamlet instead of Macbeth? Because I really struggle with because when he brings up Hamlet, I understand and I really appreciate your paper and all the connections because that's helped me a lot. But I do wonder that if there was a reason why he wouldn't have chose Macbeth instead, because to me, the downward spiral of just being the Dionysian is Macbeth. So I'm just trying to, and this is just your opinion, I'm just throwing this out there to see what you think of it, so.
Yeah, that's a really fun question. And I think maybe, I would agree with some of the maybe partial answer that you were hinting at, that if indeed Nietzsche is like his end of Birth of Tragedy, how can these two elements be fused together? If that's his personal preference, and as you said, Macbeth maybe is I'd be curious maybe to hear more, since what you mean by Macbeth being only Dionysianism. But there are a few different things that I think Nietzsche would like about Hamlet. Number one, he's very theatrical. And in my reading, I think he is, he's trying to be in control of this antic disposition that he puts on. And so the artfulness there, the artfulness with him directing the actors. I mean, these are all things that I think, you know, reflect a soul more open to artistic expression than I think anything we get in the character of Macbeth. And clearly Macbeth is, I think there's more of an argument to be made that Hamlet by the end of the play is put together, that he has more sovereignty over himself. And there's I think one of the quotes I read, Nietzsche refers to that there's still a multiplicity of desires being harmonized by a master drive. And I think with Macbeth, there's he becomes more and more convicted of his path, less and less, I guess, anxious or kind of oscillating about. But it's definitely a flatter, muter, one-dimensional, I think, pursuit of an end that it's hard to, I don't know. I get the impression that that Macbeth is much more of a, if he's united, it's more in the sense of he's more of an automaton than he is this kind of I don't know, dynamic, like Hamlet's just a lot more fun to listen to.
I think it's more like, yeah, like I see what you're saying. Maybe Hamlet's more internal struggle, and what Macbeth has all these outside forces that are kind of leading him to his doom. Maybe.
Like I'm thinking of just like Macbeth in like during the siege sequence, and there's just this kind of like resignation, I think is the word that I would use to describe it. But it's not there's a difference between Macbeth's resignation and like, I don't know, the conviction of a Catherine of Aragon in her suffering in Henry VIII, or of a Hermione on trial in The Winter's Tale. There's a conviction and like a kind of unity of, and I'm not sure Nietzsche would like admire any of them, but there can be a unity of purpose and intention in a character without being kind of this, I keep coming back to like, he's just kind of I read Macbeth as in kind of he's very one-dimensional at the end. Whereas before we had genuine conflict in his conscience. It wasn't, yeah, I have to think about that more, but this is all just me ripping off the cuff. And
No,
I don't think
I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, that was very helpful to me. I was just trying to figure it out because I would have just automatically thought for sure that he would have picked Macbeth, but I think I see what you're saying. It's a good question though. I might put it to students because it's a really good thought question, I think, to really get their brains flowing.
That is a great question and brings in another, another work and another dynamic. And this is totally off the top of my head because I haven't considered those two plays in years, and I definitely haven't considered them in relation to Nietzsche. But having heard the question, the thing that jumps out at me that I hadn't thought of before is there's so much supernatural stuff in Macbeth, and okay, I guess there's the ghost in Hamlet, but still it seems like Macbeth is a much more haunted kind of play than Hamlet. Now I don't would that appeal or unappeal to Nietzsche?
In terms of what's Nietzsche's, like, does Nietzsche appreciate supernatural elements in art or in reality?
I'm just wondering if he would, like many other moderns, just kind of brush off a play that has too many supernatural elements as, oh, that's silly, that's stupid. I suspect he wouldn't, but that would be a very modern kind of way to disassemble it.
It's a good point, Kim, because honestly, I mean, I didn't think of that, but like most people wouldn't even go to Macbeth, they wouldn't even say the play out loud, right? And then they wouldn't even go to see it because they were afraid that they'd be cursed. So I guess if Nietzsche wanted to reach an audience, maybe Macbeth wouldn't be the play to choose. And that's a good point too, is maybe But I always think of the Dionysians as witches running around a fire when I think of them. So there's that.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, no, just jumping in. It seems that he very much thinks that, at least in Birth of Tragedy, that that metaphysical comfort is something desirable coming out of cultic. And when he traces historically where he sees Dionysian echoes, even in like medieval Christian times, they're still associated with religious festivals of some kind. So I don't think he's going to push. He doesn't strike me as a reader who's going to push the supernatural out of Shakespeare, or like dismiss it, or not read things out of it for his own purposes, whether or not it's Shakespeare's design. But in that way, I think he's a lot more fun of a critic than some others.
Right. No, as the question was unfolding, that was the first thing that occurred to me as why a modern audience might tend to prefer Hamlet. It just seems like the more modern. It seems like the more believable, psychological, plausible kind of play to a modern audience than Macbeth, which seems still so. And I don't know, when I've seen Macbeth, yeah, I mean, it's fun. It's a fun play. It's nice and short. It's impactful. But I guess I guess I'm enough of a modern that the supernatural stuff did distance it from me somewhat.
Maybe that could be a question for you all who are involved in teaching. What is one possible guess would be, and I don't know if this is true, that it's easier to explain Hamlet in terms of psychological phenomena,
Exactly.
and not Macbeth. Macbeth,
Right.
You have to deal with these things somehow, and Hecate shows up, and so it's
Right.
possible that maybe the consensus among a lot of popular readings in high schools is just that, yeah, he's probably crazy, or at least that does enough explanatory legwork where you don't have to do purgatory theology discussion.
Right. You've exactly intuited the kind of question I was asking, and the kind of question that goes when I make up a syllabus is, what, and how I would turn it to anyone. I think especially Richard, because you started your presentation thinking about and asking about teaching and students and what we know versus what they know, and what we and they know versus what Shakespeare knew. And I like that introduction. So I will say at the beginning, so when I'm making a syllabus, yes, I'm trying to connect with students, and I'm always trying to come up with ancient, medieval, early modern artifacts that, yes, I can put into some kind of, I don't know, but believable, relevant kind of framework for them. I still want to challenge the contemporary view. I still want to challenge the modern worldview, but yeah, I try to steer away from things that are, as you said, hard to explain to a modern audience, and where the modern audience would just say, I don't get that. That's something they thought back in the day. Anything that's going to distance students that way. Yeah, well, like right now I'm teaching Dante. Okay, Dante I believe in enough, I guess, that I have to overcome that hurdle. I have to unpack it enough for students. But if I was going to teach a Shakespeare play, absolutely I would choose Hamlet over Macbeth for that exact reason. So I would open up to what are we trying to do when we teach Shakespeare?
And Kim, this falls into your idea really of Augustine and how he really, I mean, it links really well, because what you're saying about Augustine is, to him, this astrology was real because his condemnation of it makes it real. I mean, he pushes so far to say, no matter what, don't do this, because there was a belief there, where Shakespeare, the belief wasn't as strong. I mean, he uses it more in a playful, like flippant way. And so it's a different way to look at it. And it's kind of the same thing. What you're saying is, once you're distant from it, it's kind of harder to connect. So that's a good point.
Right. That's part of it. Yep.
I mean, I wonder, just looking at like Barnes and Noble every now and then, if like astrology is more believed in our time than it was in Shakespeare's. But that's just my my sort of joke for the day. But
Yeah, and I thought that all during the pandemic, you know, that I mean the ultimate, I mean, you know, lack of belief in vaccinations. I mean that to me sounds that to me sounds much more absurd and self-destructive than me reading my horoscope each morning, which I do in the newspaper. You know, so the idea that us moderns are just totally sold on the idea of science and we're totally dismissive of magic. Um, uh, Recent events have shaken my faith in that. If I ever had faith in that, I didn't really. You know, I think that we're all very muddled, and that's why the one line I threw in there was, when Augustine continues for decades to consult astrologers, I think his rationalization is exactly what modern people would say is the old chicken soup joke, right? Well, it can't hurt, right? There's no medical evidence that chicken soup's going to help you. It's like, well, give it to him anyway. Fine. Well, it can't hurt. So Augustine can go to these astrologers, and as long as they're not doing anything harmful, it's no big deal. So his commitment to belief in astrology is minimal, but therefore his rejection of it is tepid too. I mean, it's just like, it's no big deal to him.
I feel like
until he thinks he has irrefutable evidence, then he's like, okay, fine, get rid of it.
It's fact. I really appreciated the way that your paper opened up. You know, it's Augustine is not just, you know, he has this religious a priori thing, and so, oh, this sounds like competing religion, reject it. Like he's willing to, like, you know, wade into that. And I think that's a frequent misconception for just going back through the City of God for a political class. His engagement of Plato is, among others, pretty nuanced, and it's hard to, like, there are times where he refrains from saying what his actual reading is, what his reading of Plato is, and it's a complicated dynamic of assessing other traditions and drawing from them at times. It's definitely not just, I think, a knee-jerk kind of simplistic kind of apologist that we encounter there.
Yep.
That's a huge question. Why do we teach the weird stuff in Shakespeare? The Jupiters coming out of the clouds in Cymbeline, and
where did the idea? We keep talking about the absurd. Is that Heidegger? Was that Heidegger? Does anybody know? Being in Time, wasn't he the one that brought up the absurd, and then followed by Kierkegaard or something? It's like this idea of the absurd. I mean, it just keeps, it changes minimally, but, you know, it's just like this very huge theme that's just been there forever. So
I think one of the dimensions of I'm trying to look right now at the lay plays a lot, and primarily from the political angle, but I'm really struck by both as a word and as I think the idea of patience keeps coming up time and time again in Shakespeare. I mean, Catherine of Aragon's, like, Lady in Waiting is named Patience at her deathbed, and there are a bunch of times where in Cymbeline the government of patience is being invoked, and I think that in order to be patient in the sense of suffering well through adversity, whether it's, you know, the result of your own flaws and mistakes, or just kind of the unfortunate way that fortune has dealt you a bad hand, it seems as though for Shakespeare, one of the dynamics there is a kind of, if not explicitly providential worldview that I think comes out in some of his late characters. There does have to be a kind of open disposition, a lack of either desire for absolute control over circumstances, or a kind of, I think he really is cautioning heavily against the way that romantic idealism can put you in that direction, or can close off your imagination to, like, especially the danger of evil people. So, like Macduff, Macduff in Macbeth. I think there's a really interesting way in which his wife's conversation with his son right before they get killed, and even Macduff's own choice to, like, leave them there, time and time again, this refrain of, well, we didn't want to give the bad guys cause to kill us, so we, you know, didn't take precaution against the bad, like the underestimation of evil is like an imaginative failure, I think, that he depicts a lot. I think you see that in Richard III as well. You know, with Hastings, it's like, well, we don't want to give the impression that we're guilty, so we won't, you know, take precaution. Like, there seems to be a sense in which the more you kind of teach the supernatural as a way of you know, pushing the limits of human certainty and security in the way of the world and your own plans and fabrications. I think Shakespeare has a great, he certainly wouldn't agree with Augustine on lying and fabrication. And so my sense is that there's still, even the great fabricators, even the great like Pisanio giving Imogen another gender reversal plan in Cymbeline, it has its limits. And he says, like, fortune brings in some boats that aren't steered. And I think that one guess would be, or approach to that question is, I think teaching the supernatural, providential, and just weird parts of Shakespeare can be a helpful reminder that the virtue of patience that he really wants to, I think, communicate is in some ways is dependent on a healthy appreciation for human finitude and the limits of our knowledge of the workings of the world. Be one possible response.
I do have a comment for Richard, and it's really actually not on your actual paper, but you did mention that as an educator, you felt like, well, this is just written, kind of scribbled here, but that you felt like educators needed to know more than their footnotes. And I think that idea is so good. And I mean, it could be a paper in itself. An experience that I had early on when the first college I worked for, they wanted us to go get our teaching certificates. This is when Texas in this area opened up dual credit. And so I had that year taught along with the college classes. It was a long year, but I taught 10th and 11th graders as well to achieve that secondary certificate. And during that time, I did notice that there was this lack of knowledge and understanding of the subject that these teachers were teaching in high school. And it was really hard even to have conversations with them about their subject matter, because they really were given textbooks that said, give the students this, here's your answer sheet, and this is how they're supposed to answer the questions. And it was just mind-blowing, because with college teaching, when I walked in with my first college teaching job, they basically said, here's the classes that you're going to teach, good luck. You know, so I went home and had to make all these classes. But it's definitely something that I think I really appreciate you saying, because I think there is a lack of knowledge as far as, you know, that K through 12, well, especially the 9 through 12 understanding of the subject, and being that I think that you teach in that area, that's something that, you know, really needs to be addressed, and that more teachers like you should be more willing to dive, you know, under the surface and really be able to lecture their subject, just walk in and give an hour lecture on the subject from their brain, you know, rather than, you know, have to use a textbook to always do that. And so anyway, I just wanted to point that out, but I thought that was really refreshing to hear.
Thank you. We don't have textbooks at my school, so we're kind of forced to go and do our research and hopefully get to know our subject. But I think coming back to Kim's question as well, it's just I just find this period, Shakespeare the writer, and this period fascinating, because it is a key to unlock so many other areas of knowledge, and you're continuously forced, because of Shakespeare's mind and his writing, and the fact that we don't have a diary, we don't know his innermost thoughts, we don't have interviews, to try and work out how he was thinking about what he was reading. So that's why I really respect the work of people that have really tried to look at the plays and look at the influences and try and work out Shakespeare's mind from his writing. And as soon as you open one door, another door opens, and it goes on and on and on. And I think I'm just trying to work out, because I'm going to be back teaching Hamlet in a week's time to a new group of students. I've just been doing some 19th century writing with them. We're going to go back in time. I'm just trying to think about how you unlock a text for them. As I gain more confidence, I think I really want to try and concertina the teaching of Hamlet, where we do very, very intense close readings, but then we pull back and say, like, we read 3 or 4 scenes without loads of annotations, because it's a 4-hour play. It can take you a long time to read through if you're just reading it through in the class all the time. So you just need to find ways to be able to give them big pictures and then and zoom right in. And little bits of knowledge. I'm going to go to the Bate book as well. He's a UK academic that's working in America at the moment. I can't remember which college he's working at, but if you don't know Jonathan Bate's work, his new book on Fitzgerald and Keats comparison is fantastic. His previous book on Wordsworth and Ted Hughes. He's not just a biographer. He cut his teeth by editing the collected works of Shakespeare and then writing about Shakespeare. But there's a little thing here. Shakespeare was not allowed to portray the Christian God on stage. He probably would not have wished to. His fascination with human passions was such that pagan polytheism suited him well. He was interested in Juno as wronged wife, Venus as embodiment of desire, Apollo as patron of art, and Mercury as the fleet-footed force of communication, and in the abusive power of Jupiter, to whom Falstaff comically compares himself in The Merry Wives of Windsor. And as soon as you get a sense of the fact that he was testing himself out in a commercially dangerous market, the fixed stage in London, because his only exposure before that would have been touring theatre. This was a new art form. He was testing his arm in a new art form, the mostly open air, but they went inside as well, from the Globe to Blackfriars. And when you know that he couldn't represent God on stage, and neither could he explicitly comment on the situation with the various attempts on Elizabeth I and to depose Elizabeth I. So he couldn't either represent politics directly either. And so that kind of knowledge just means, okay, the importance of illusion and setting things in Italy, or setting things in the War of the Roses, were very, very important to him, because otherwise he would be in the tower. He'd be locked up. So I think that it's finding those ways of giving decent context and giving your students an understanding of restrictions on the art form that help them understand therefore what was Shakespeare's wiggle room. Where was he trying to use classical texts and use illusion to excite and entertain his audience? How far was he prepared to take those kind of risks?
Yeah, I think it was Charlie was in a conference with me yesterday, and she was mentioning that there's so much empowerment with just the text and the student, without any other outside sources. And so she's probably listening right now. But yeah, that's what we were talking about yesterday. So you're right. I think that's a good idea to take away the footnotes, take away any outside resources, just to have them connect with the text like that. It's a good idea.
I wonder, and again, there's probably a variety of, I wonder your guys' sense, you teachers, of the pulse, checking the pulse of just the language, the degree to which you feel like you're translating Shakespeare with like high school students or secondary. Like, it does seem to me, I am incredibly reliant on good glosses to correct all kinds of errors that I come to the text over and over again. It's just one of those things of, and this is maybe a bigger pedagogical question. I wonder both how much Shakespeare do your students seem to have before before you're working with them, and do you feel like something I've been talking with some friends about is just both the need to sometimes just really slow down, and a lot of students, COVID didn't do a lot for attention spans in terms of, will they actually look up the words that they don't know and the phrases that they don't know? Will they actually do that? But it seems like there's both a lot of value maybe in slowing down, working with scenes, working with monologues, soliloquies first for those that don't have a lot of exposure. But then also it seems like there's a lot of secondary benefits when you have the occasional student working with a Chaucer or working with another form of difficult English in its form. What are kind of the bridges to getting Shakespeare literacy from just the comprehension standpoint? Because I do feel like a huge downside I'm hearing from friends who are teaching in high school, my wife teaches high school drama, is you get inoculated by the gist. You get the gist of it, and it's like, there's nothing really special about this. I understood 60% of what this monologue said, went in and out. And I worry that it's like you can always go endlessly in that direction of, well, let's go from 80 to 90 to 95% of comprehension. That's just unrealistic for so many teachers' time. But I'm curious what your guys' sense of Shakespearean literacy is, just from a comprehension of what's being said right now, and what might be some ways to improve that when you're.
Well, I think you have to meet your students where they are. I mean, Shakespeare is flowery and beautiful, and we all appreciate it on where we are, but with students, a lot of times the most simple translations are the best, because you want them to connect with the story, not with the language necessarily in the beginning. And then a lot of times, like I will with the high schoolers with that age level, I don't think of myself as teaching Shakespeare as much as teaching critical thinking, because it's the critical thinking skills that have to be put in place as the foundation for understanding any text like this, any classical text. And if they can't use the tools that critical thinking requires, then they're not going to understand anything. And so sometimes, like with the soliloquy, you can just put it in front of them and really let them work as groups and really focus on what is it that it means without giving them any information from your own brain. You have to step back and let them do it. And that's kind of how I've found it. I don't work with high schoolers a whole lot nowadays though, but my beginning, like if I have early college students, it's the same thing. It's like the exact same. So I have to teach them critical thinking too. I mean, it's only at the upper college levels that I feel like I'm actually teaching the text itself. So it's just a really different dynamic. Richard might have something else though.
Sometimes you just have to push the tables back and give them a script and get them acting. This is, I think you have to mix it up. You need those times where everything slows down and we're all looking at individual words. That's very important. I think being self-critical with my A-level class, which is 16 to 18, I think when I taught Hamlet 2 years ago, when I started teaching it, I didn't vary the pace. I was so concerned about ensuring each word was glossed that we went through it at a snail's pace, and I killed it for them. I only kind of won their hearts and minds back at the end when a student took the challenge to memorize all 7 soliloquies, and we filmed them. And it was a great moment where we all got behind one student, and she literally delivered them in over the space of an hour and a half with hardly a foot put wrong. I've got those on YouTube, actually. I can send you the link. She was a German student who was staying with us over in the UK. And she just took my challenge up and said, I'll memorize those. I'll do it. And it was a lesson to me, is that this is why I've only been thinking about this metaphor the last 2 days. You've probably with the experience we have in this room, got a better way of describing it. I'm calling it a concertina approach. Is we need to go in tight and hard and detailed and word by word, but then we have to have that pulling back, and that pulling back might also just be saying, here's the scripts, right? We're gonna act this out for a bit and just block out what are the battlements look like, why does the play start, who's there, why are those two words so significant in terms of their philosophical undertow throughout the play. Where are we, and what are we doing? And I'm still working this stuff through, but yeah, I think we have to be be prepared to be experimental.
I'm reminded of the John Barton playing Shakespeare series. Oh, so good. That's like maybe like that was kind of the first college setting like reading Shakespeare that I had ever really gotten. That was so good. Yeah, and very, like you said, like he's giving you one thing and suddenly we're changing gears, and you know, and yet there's still that, yeah, experimental structure is a lot of fun, for sure.
I need to go and read the Birth of Tragedy properly. I've skimmed it, I must admit. I love the fact that you just really focused in on this understanding kills action. I want to be sure until by the time we finish this discussion, I need you to explain to me, not because it was at all unclear, but if my brain was having trouble taking it in, exactly what your thesis was at the end. You're rejecting Nietzsche's Dionysian view of Hamlet. I just wanted to be sure that I understood what that was. If you don't mind, just revisiting that a second.
Sure. Yeah. So I do think there's a lot. I was trying to highlight the way that, you know, I don't think Nietzsche is, you know, approaching Hamlet trying to like read him the way I'm reading him. The play and the character. I think he likes using things creatively for his purposes, and sometimes it's not about a close reading of the text. But I do think that his idea of Dionysianism that he connects to Hamlet illuminates the way that that Hamlet both is you know, truly the inertia, the unwillingness to do certain things, whether it's not kill Claudius or his kind of lack of a plan when he returns to Denmark. Those are things that can just as well be explained. You have to consider multiple motives. I think it's not just his like a cowardice, simply speaking, but he genuinely has. I think John Ellis's Shakespeare's Honor, his chapter on Hamlet, is really, really good on this. The way that he has deep anxieties, misgivings about fate, about the world, about the body, and his rejection and angst towards those. Is part of his not doing things in various points. And I think that Nietzsche gets us starting to think in that way. Is there a way that, you know, knowledge might make you think this is either absurd or grotesque, and that therefore refrain from feeling like you have to write the political situation. But I do think that I find it difficult, and this is true of almost any tragedy, and therefore it might be too bold to claim, but I think definitely Shakespearean tragedy. I think the difficulty is that, you know, Nietzsche will talk about what Ophelia represents, but his focus on just as far as I can see on Hamlet crowds out the richness of scenes like Ophelia's grave that I wanted to point to, where I think the effect elicited from the audience is dependent on there being not merely cosmic absurdity. Because yeah, that could be sad in itself. We have desires that, you know, don't actually maybe have objective fulfillment, and we're doing our best, or how one responds to that as a Dionysian, maybe under an Apollonian kind of vision of peace or peacefulness. Maybe there's a world in which some parts of Shakespeare reflect that, but I think the more simple explanation for a lot of the poignancy I read in Shakespeare, including in Hamlet, is that Hamlet could have done things differently, that these were contingent choices made by human beings, especially like Polonius. And so we should feel the weight of Hamlet's choices to stab through the curtain and to reject. Of like, me and my wife have had the pleasure to in one of those Shakespeare classes to act that scene together, Hamlet rejecting Ophelia, and the language itself, I think, points to ambiguity. And that's the difficulty of reading Shakespeare from a scholarly perspective, is actors can have a lot of flexibility to infuse the text with their interpretation and make the practical wisdom of the play come out very differently. But I think there's a lot of ambiguity. I think the most dramatic way to do that, those kind of scenes, stress the contingency, the choice involved, that Hamlet has an actual desire to be with Ophelia, a desire that Gertrude imagines in a very powerful way, and that is thwarted. And you can say, well, maybe, you know, Hamlet has all these knowledge problems with respect to the ghost. Maybe, you know, maybe it never could have worked out. But I do think teasing the kind of comedic vision at different points in the play, which I think Shakespeare pays off in his late romances. How could these tragedies look like comedies? I think that's a lot of the power of the play. And I think if you just start with a cosmic absurdity as kind of a cosmological basis for reading everything, you run over a lot of these subplots, a lot of these smaller characters, and I think some of the moral seriousness that Shakespeare's, some of the cool questions about these characters get kind of run over by Nietzsche's approach, I think, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's really, really useful. Kim, I really enjoyed your reading of Edmund, and it made me think when you were reading some of his soliloquy, whether he's an even more refined version of Polonius in terms of being a Machiavellian type of character. I used to love Edmund as a youth, and when I was auditioning for parts, I often used Edmund's soliloquy as the key speech, because it's one of the best sort of Machiavellian speeches I think that Shakespeare's ever written in that character.
And again, for me, it goes back to the earlier question that I posed. So I guess I'm drawing everything back to my questions. My questions are almost always pedagogical, and I think, you know, as I think Edmund is this, like a lot of characters in that I focus on in books that I pick. He's this, you know, I'd say identifiably modern character. And therefore, you know, he gives you an entree into this other world where you do start thinking about things that are not uniquely or specifically modern. I guess that's what I'm often trying to do with these texts. Okay, so he's modern. You know, it's not a play. It's not a play about the mystery of evil. You know, the well, I mean, it is somewhat. That's what makes it interesting. Because you can't figure out, I don't think you can figure out why the Lear girls are so evil, right? But with Edmund, and it has struck me, and it has been such a refreshing thing about teaching the play. I think when I was just sitting alone reading the play, I didn't realize how abused Edmund is by his father until I had me and the kids read it out loud in class, and I was like, oh my God, what he's doing to him in public. And then it's like, aha, this is not unexplainable evil. This is the evil that you get when you abuse somebody their whole childhood and upbringing, and then they turn evil. Then you can't say, well, that's unexplained. No, that's perfect. That's very easy to explain. So this is just a roundabout way of saying, yes, he's great. It goes back to the earlier question about, you know, what do you teach in class, or what do you unpack? And I have to say, I feel bad for the rest of the play. You know, we spend most of our time on the first scene, Edmund's soliloquy, okay, maybe one day on the storm, you know, and then almost nothing on the end, right? I really don't know. I don't have time for it at that point, I guess. But I mean, so I guess, you know, in our Zoom meeting language, we do deep dives on particular, quite short, quite compact passages. I mean, the soliloquy is, it's not a big one really, right? I mean, it's just a page, right? But just go really into depth, every word, unpack it.
Fantastic.
One of the it
Well, I mean,
reminds me.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, please.
I'm curious. Then the last seminar I did with Lear, the focus was heavily on Edgar, and so I wonder, as a way of future questions, like how you feel about, you know, Edgar's relationship with his brother and the ending. Like, is it like unbelievable that Edmund seems to have this change of heart? I have a kind of view, but I don't want to.
And honestly, you know, I'm not doing this to sell the book, but you know, read the book. In the last chapter, I really come back to that because not to focus on that, but to focus on my reading of the book. Because I know when I taught this at the beginning of my teaching career, so almost 30 years ago, I know we focused more on Edgar in the discussions, right? So it was something, and again, that's where reading the play, seeing the play on stage, reading it out loud in class, those are wildly different experiences, and they bring out a wildly different understanding of the exact same words on the page. So and the reason I paired those two books, Confessions and Lear, is because they're two books that I've taught over the entirety of my teaching career, so a long span of time. And the way I read them and the things I bring out in class, or the things that I and the students together bring out in class, have really changed over time. So I'm agreeing with you, you know, and I actually like those readings where we focused on Edgar, because they're the more hopeful readings, right? And I never want to say the play has a happy ending. It doesn't, but they're more hopeful. And I hope someday maybe I get back to that reading. But I remember that was a very early career experience of the play for me. And you know, this time I focused. I mean, I have, as I get older, and I suppose it makes sense. As I get older, I focus more on Lear, the character, and there it's a very different experience. So to your original question, no, I don't think the ending's unbelievable at all. The way the real ending, the ending that Shakespeare left us, and I do like to, or I liked when I was a younger teacher, I like to focus on that experience of Edgar, and throughout. I mean, the whole when he's in disguise, when he's leading Lear and his father, it is it's a very differently beautiful experience and interlude really in the play.
Because I almost wonder, it's remarkable that someone as thoughtful and rhetorically powerful as Edmund can be moved by hearing a story in the ending that he is, by Edgar's story. And so that's one of those like meta-narrative like questions. I think that, like, you know, what does Shakespeare think storytelling can do? I think one answer is, well, can it actually change an Edmund kind of Machiavel, and really open him to something he hadn't considered before, in spite of the fact that his father, you know, treated him the way he did. I think there's something maybe similar going on in Autolycus in The Winter's Tale, who hears a very long story in 5/2, and I think Shakespeare deliberately leaves it ambiguous. Like, is there a new life? Because he was the first character I thought of in terms of being littered under Mercury. That, you know, cosmological question, does that define him? Is the Odyssean mode, does that define him in an absolute way, or can storytelling move even someone, you know, so apparently committed? I think there's some characters that, okay, it's really hard to imagine Regan and Goneril. We don't have their, but even what's his face, Albany, there's a remarkable arc there that sometimes totally gets like hidden or run over by like performances. And I think that yeah.
You're right. I mean, maybe, and that again, that's another aspect that I didn't bring out so much this time through, but the transformation of Albany and Edgar Gloucester, right? I mean, there are transformations in a play that's overall filled with people who are so set in their ways, good or bad, you know. But I like that you remind us that the transform, I don't want to say transformative, but the characters who are transformed are peripheral and striking. Oh, and then of course, well, okay, then it comes out in a really striking microcosm right in the middle with a servant who stabs Cornwall, right? I mean that's such an amazing scene. And that's one that's amazing whether you're reading it on the page, and God knows when you see it on stage, it's amazing because it's the eye gouging too, right? I mean that cataclysmic scene really emphasizes transformation, and in that case, very sudden. And as you say, maybe we kind of shrug it off and say, "Oh, that's unbelievable. That couldn't happen." But wow, when you're in the theater, it's happening, and you're feeling it. Yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah, it's a bummer because the more you get away from the text and into quite like maybe my favorite scene right now, very small, is just the description that a gentleman gives of Cordelia when she's returned to England.
Yep.
The Queen's driving against her like smiling sorrow, I think, is a real thing that Shakespeare is fascinated with in many plays. And then of course you get people like, well, like, this is in a quarto, so maybe Shakespeare didn't actually, right? And you're like, yep. I'm gonna pull my hair out, but it's what it does on stage. I think there's a reason that it's in so many critical editions, and why you have to grab. I think a lot of 19th century critics that I've run into are way too quick to just be like, like that's not believable. Therefore, it was either a later interpolation or someone. Shakespeare not. It's like, yeah, I think Shakespeare wrote some pretty weak stuff, but that doesn't mean that everything that's weak has to.
Right. We don't. Right.
So sorry, what was the title of the book that you mentioned?
It's just Google Reading Augustine. It's in the Reading Augustine series, and a lot of the books in it are interesting. But mine will be out in June.
Okay.
And this is a merely personal, not Shakespearean question. You said you're at the University of Dallas?
Mm-hmm.
I only know her maiden name, Deborah Romanek.
Yeah.
Right. Is she still there? Right.
Yeah, Dr. Romanek Baldwin, I think. Yeah.
Baldwin, that was it. Yes. Yep. I worked with her at Villanova.
Oh, great.
Years ago.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I just had I haven't interacted with her that much. She's literature and I'm politics, but had a great chat with her recently. We did another really cool work of art that helps maybe modern audiences get into the supernatural in a fun way. She and the Cowan Center here held this little discussion lecture on the Russian novel Laurus. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that. I think it's like 2014 or 15. But it's like a kind of medieval Russia life kind of model off of Life of the Saints, but it's like this, again, very contemporary, and it just throws you into, I don't know, some people are saying it's fun. I'm really enjoying it so far, but that was my last interaction with Dr. Romanek Baldwin, was talking about this weird Russian hermit guy. So
okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're my regards to her when you see her again.
Will do.
Yeah. All right,
I have to ask, in my just full disclosure, just like my quick bio details, just seeing who my other panelists were. Richard, have you acted in professionally before? Like an IMDb profile came up.
Yeah, so
Just it's for total curiosity.
back in the day, when I was
Okay.
very young. So I was in the 1968 as a 4-year-old moth in a Midsummer Night's Dream film version, directed by Peter Hall, with Judi Dench as Titania.
Okay.
Yeah, so I do have a line. And then about 3 years later, I was Caius Marsus, the young Coriolanus, in the RSC version. And I dabbled a bit after I left teaching the first time before I came back. So I did a bit of acting and extra work, but small time stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. The roots go deep. The Shakespeare roots.
Yeah. I was born in Stratford upon Avon because my father worked in the theatre. So.
That's awesome.
So yeah. You just thinking about King Lear. Actually, I still go back to a performance I saw. I think it was directed by Adrian Noble at the Stratford, and Michael Gambon was playing Lear, and Anthony Sher was playing the Fool. Jenny Agutter was playing Goneril, and it was an awesome experience to see as a sort of 16, 17-year-old. I think when I speak to people about going to theatre as well, I'm aware of a generation of teachers that inspired me, who had a chance to go and see some of those RSC productions in the 60s. So that's when I was born. But those people that went to see David Warner's Hamlet, they queued around the block for it. Ian Holm and David Warner and others in the War of the Roses that John Barton and Peter Hall put together. That made an impact in our country and a whole swathe of English teachers, because they got to see those performances when the RSC was effectively reinterpreting Shakespeare for the modern age, if you like. It was the baby boomers' attempt to understand Shakespeare, and it was from everything I can understand, it was a magical moment in terms of freedom of interpretation and the transforming of the stage. So yeah, they were special times, special moments. I think we'll have to leave the discussion about what the greatest Shakespeare play is to another time. But both of you have represented plays that they always come head to head. Hamlet or King Lear, they always seem to be the ones where, if you kind of put the comedies aside for a second, it's a face-off between Hamlet and King Lear. King Lear usually wins, I find, but I'm not sure justifiably. I love both plays so much.
You're gonna tease that question and then say we'll have to leave it for later. That's not fair.
Yeah, no, we'll have to go into the mingle room or have a pint of beer and argue it out.
Sounds great.
Okay, it's been great sharing a panel with you. I hope it was useful, Tess. Your name on the screen, but I hope it was an interesting discussion. And hopefully I'll catch up with everybody at the other parts of the conference. I'm going to go to a few other things. So.
Yeah. Likewise. No, thank you guys very much. This was a pleasure.
Really good talking to you guys. Thank you for presentations. Thank you.
Thank you all, and I hope we're not virtual at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amen to that.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Cheers, guys.
Have a good one.
And you.